There's obviously a lot of interest in this initiative and in terms of this work, not just because there's a huge concern about the impacts of climate on water and sanitation service delivery, but I think there's just a lot of advances in terms of knowledge generation on all the work that's being ongoing on climate resilient wash interventions, programming, and policies. And we know that there's been a lot of political will being generated, especially through the Global Goal on Adaptation at international level, which we'll hear about. So I think you're probably here and you probably joined us because you're interested in what constitutes a climate resilient wash. And for some people, they may think of infrastructure, some people may think of services, and some people may think of systems of government. And it may be all those things, and we're going to get into that. But what we're really hoping to have an exchange with all of you on today is how to measure this. So what is optimal and feasible? And my name is Bruce Gordon. I'm from the World Health Organization. I lead our water sanitation and hygiene work from Geneva. And I'm co-welcoming you with my colleague, Aidan Cronin from UNICEF, who I'll pass over to right now. So Aidan, if you're there, floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Welcome, everyone. And as Bruce said, great to see so many people on the call reflecting the importance of this topic and its criticality, I think, within the context of the climate crisis. So we're very honored as UNICEF to be working with WHO on this as part of our collaboration on JMP and GLAAS, a very strong collaboration, and one I think that, the fact that this work you'll hear about this morning is being done by both JMP and GLAAS together is very important, because it means that we're actually getting that synergy across absolute numbers progress towards SDG 6.1 and 2, but also the systems progress behind that. So those are two really important parts of this story. So we'll hear this morning on the monitoring initiative around climate resilient wash. We'll also hear a little bit around another initiative happening also as part of the partnership around tracking of system strengthening, developing a core set of indicators for tracking wash system strengthening. And that, again, will really synergize well with this work. There's good complementarity across both elements of the work. And, I think, again, to keep that bigger picture in mind as we go through. So just wanted to maybe make 2 points kind of from a housekeeping perspective. One is to put any questions you may have as they arise into the chat box. We'll deal with those either as they come up or in a dedicated session on Q&A a little bit later. But as you can see from the agenda here, shortly we'll hand over for some context from Jose to the initiative. Then we'll hear directly on on how JMP and GLAAS are approaching this review from Marina and Rick. And then Barbara Evans from University of Leeds will give us a project description of the overall approach and timeline as of now. And as I mentioned, we'll come to a Q&A, and then we'll have next steps and closing by Bruce. So maybe without further ado, I'll jump out here and hand it over for Jose's presentation on the context. Thank you. Oh, and sorry, I should have mentioned this slide, that you will have a bunch of people on the call today. Some are missing or will join the call tomorrow. But you've Marina and Fiona and Betsy from the GLAAS team. You've Tom and Rick from the JMP team, also supporting from UNICEF's side on GLAAS, and we will be hearing from the various colleagues over the 2 webinars. There's another public webinar tomorrow at another time to facilitate other time zones. So with that, I'll pass over, and thank you very much again.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Jose Gesti, and I'm working as climate advisor at the Secretariat of Sanitation and Water for our partnership. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you in this important webinar today, where my task is to provide a context to what is going to be discussed. The main focus of the discussion today is around the Joint Monitoring Programme and the Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, the GLAAS, initiative to integrate climate resilience into ongoing monitoring efforts. As I said, my task is to provide a little bit of a background to this work. And I wanted to start with bringing to your attention the global goal on adaptation. Indeed, the Paris Agreement back in 2015 said in its Article 7 the global goal on adaptation. The first paragraph of the Article 7 outlines that this global goal is established to enhance adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience, and to reduce vulnerability to climate change. And while this is very important and interesting, somehow the rest of the article is kind of vague, and it doesn't give you a lot of structure and a lot of a way forward in a way to take such a goal into practice. Not only that, it's very difficult. It doesn't give this article doesn't give you enough information as to what should be done and whether progress could be tracked at the global level towards adaptation and resilience. These have been big challenges that have been perceived by the climate community, but also from the different sectors and thematic areas working with sustainable development and climate adaptation. It is because of that that a few years after the Paris Agreement was outlining this global goal on adaptation, that in COP26 in Glasgow, parties to the Paris Agreement decided to launch a 2-year work program, 2022 and 2023, to come together and try to bring a little bit more what are the bones of such a global goal on adaptation, how can countries can move towards such a goal, and ideally how progress could be tracked at the global level, just to understand whether the world is doing good or bad in terms of progressing towards climate adaptation. The good news is that the end of this 2-year program at COP28, December last year in Dubai, saw the agreement of parties by consensus to adopt a global climate resilience framework that is directly linked to the global goal on adaptation, and that brings much more clarity as to what are the thematic areas to move and how countries can move towards advancing climate adaptation. Indeed, what we want to bring to your attention in this slide is that the framework that is adopted, the Global Climate Resilience Framework adopted in December 2023 at COP28, brings water and sanitation to the forefront of the climate adaptation agenda, because the first thematic target that is set in this framework is actually devoted to water and sanitation. The target is, as the rest of the thematic targets, is to be achieved by 2030, or in brackets, progressively beyond. And it says that by 2030, the world should be significantly reducing climate-induced water scarcity, should be enhancing climate resilience to water-related hazards, and should move towards climate-resilient water supply and climate-resilient sanitation, while overall advancing towards access towards safe and affordable potable water for all. As you can see on the slide, this first target is accompanied by 6 other thematic targets, calling for food resilient systems, health resilient systems, calling also for resilience of ecosystems, where we see an explicit reference to inland water, calling for reducing the impacts and calling for the management, enhancement, restoration, and conservation of inland water ecosystems. We also see a thematic target on infrastructure and human settlements, on poverty eradication, livelihoods, and cultural heritage. As we can see and imagine, all the thematic areas are closely related to water and indeed to water and sanitation. There are clear links between water and food, water and climate resilient health, water and infrastructure, human settlements, which is mostly devoted to urban systems. And clearly, there are strong links between water, climate resilient water and sanitation, and poverty eradication. And also, there are links with cultural heritage. So this two-year work program concluded with the adoption by consensus of this framework that we have seen. And COP28 also launched, parties to the Paris Agreement decided then, at the same time of adopting this framework, launching a two-year work program, this time 2024 and 2025, which is tasked this time to advance the thinking on how to measure progress towards the targets that we've set. Again, how this two-year work program has started was with a call for submissions by parties to the Paris Agreement and observer organizations on ideas on how what could be the methodologies of work for this work program, and also initial views on indicators against the thematic targets that we've seen. So from our side, in Sanitation and Water for All, and in coordination with UNICEF, and with a mandate given by UN Water, we drafted and we submitted on behalf of the whole UN water system views on the methodologies of work for this work program, as well as initial views on the indicators for the different elements of the water and sanitation target. After that, there's been a workshop in Bhutan that we also attended. We were invited as a water community to present to climate negotiators our views on the methodologies of work and the initial views on indicators. And then the next milestone of this work program has been actually last month in the climate conference in Bonn that happens every year intersessionally in between the COPs. So parties have agreed to the modalities of work, that you can see on the screen, the milestones for this two-year work program, and what you can see on the screen is the milestones for this year, 2024. You will see on the left that there is a new call for submissions, which is due by July 31st, this week. And then we have, from our side, in Sanitation and Water for All, again, in coordination with UNICEF and the mandate from UN Water, we have drafted a new submission with what we've been requested, with views on existing indicators that are related to the thematic targets of the Global Goal Adaptation Framework. And that will be taken forward by an expert group that is being put together. The UNFCCC Secretariat will be compiling the views from all the submissions and start mapping the indicators that have been submitted, again, by parties and observers. There is a workshop scheduled this year, October 8th and 9th in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where parties and observers will take stock of where the mapping process is. And then the UNFCCC Secretariat will be publishing a report after the workshop with a compilation of the indicators that have been submitted. Then we will move forward towards COP29, where parties will further discuss the methodologies of work for 2025. The initial expectation is that indicators for the different thematic areas should be drafted by June 2025. And then what I want to show you in the last slide, and to finish this background, is that in the water supply, sanitation and hygiene sector, let's say we've been a little bit ahead of the curve, because already last year, even before this work program was launched on the indicators, or actually even before the Global Resilience Framework was adopted, we already launched a discussion within the Sanitation and Water for All Task Force on Climate, to see if we could, among the different partners and organizations working in this interface of climate, water, sanitation, and hygiene, if we could agree on a normative definition or a common based understanding what are the elements that constitute a climate resilient water supply, climate resilient sanitation, climate resilient hygiene shared service. This conversation is moving forward. Indeed, the next step is going to be in World Water Week. There will be a meeting where we will take a stock of the advances towards this common understanding and normative definition. This is clearly linked to the focus of the discussion today, which is the robust process that the Joint Monitoring Programme at the GLAAS have launched in terms of integrating climate resilience into ongoing existing monitoring efforts in the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene sector. This, as I said, this will be the core of the discussion today. We are aware that at the same time, different organizations are moving forward with trying to understand at the organizational level whether advances are being made programmatically in terms of advancing on climate adaptation and resilience within programming. What we've seen is that at the moment this is very dispersed and there is no common understanding, and obviously the aim at the end of this process could be that this process that we are going to be focusing today of the JMP and GLAAS it fits into the formal process that I've been explaining before, that is party driven, but driven by the parties of the Paris Agreement. So we would like obviously to conclude this work program of the JMP and GLAAS by feeding directly into this work program. And another big aim is that different organizations, we all start to have a common understanding, work using the same definition of climate resilient water supply and sanitation, and we actually start using the same indicators to measure progress. I hope that was a good background to kick off the discussion today. As I said, it will be focused on the JMP GLAAS process that has been set in motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jose. This is Rick Johnston, and I'm going to be taking the next bit now. My name is Rick Johnston. I'm with WHO in Geneva, and I lead the WHO side of the Joint Monitoring Programme, along with my colleague Tom Slaymaker on UNICEF. And I'm going to just give a brief introduction of what the JMP does, and then I'll pass on to Marina to talk about GLAAS. So the JMP, the J is for joint, it's a joint program between WHO and UNICEF. And we've been working for many years on monitoring progress in drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. We were actually founded in 1990, so before the Millennium Development Goals. And we had the responsibility for tracking the MDG targets, and we're now responsible for monitoring the SDG targets, the Sustainable Development Goal targets, on drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. We produce regular updates on households. Those come out in odd years. And since the start of the SDG period, we also publish reports on schools and healthcare facilities in even years. And those are our most visible outputs. But to produce them, there are really four kinds of things that we do. The first is that we provide a sort of normative role. We provide advice on indicators and methods of monitoring, including the development of new indicators and methods to meet emerging needs. The second thing that we do is we provide support to national governments as well as to regional bodies in order to strengthen national monitoring systems around WASH. The third thing is around maintaining the global databases. So we compile data from hundreds, from actually thousands of national data sources to produce internationally comparable estimates so that we can track progress over time across and also within countries. And then the last is that we're increasingly linking the data that we have on WASH with the data that we have for other SDG targets. Of course, that includes within SDG number 6. We work very closely with the GLAAS team at WHO, but also with the other parts of the UN that work on other targets within SDG 6. We also try to highlight links between WASH and other sectors, health, nutrition, poverty, all of those other elements of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. And throughout this, we have a continuous process of consulting with countries as we update the databases. We do this through our WHO and UNICEF country offices and regional offices. And there's a growing demand on us to develop and to integrate indicators for monitoring climate resilience into this monitoring work. And that's why we've launched this process jointly between JMP and GLAAS. So now let me pass over to Marina to talk about the GLAAS program.
Thanks, Rick. Next slide, please. So I'll be giving a quick overview of the UN Water Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, or the GLAAS program. There are multiple components within the GLAAS program. However, probably the best well-known is the GLAAS country survey, which is currently ongoing. Our data collection is currently open. And in this survey, we cover the key elements of WASH systems, including governance, policies and plans, coordination, monitoring systems, human resources, and finance. We also monitor national targets that countries have set for water sanitation and hygiene, as well as provisions for reaching vulnerable populations that contribute to countries being able to make progress towards SDG 6. So I think the key thing to note is that through GLAAS, we are monitoring the inputs and processes, whereas JMP is monitoring the outcomes. Through GLAAS, we support country-led processes, and we aim to identify drivers and bottlenecks of progress. This has been implemented through WHO for the past few cycles. However, starting this cycle, we are developing a much closer collaboration and will be collecting the data jointly with UNICEF starting this cycle. And perhaps less well known is that we are co-custodians of SDG targets 6A and 6B, which are the means of implementation targets for SDG 6. And so countries participating in the GLAAS survey will contribute to the monitoring of these targets, and their data will be reported through us to the UN Statistical Division. Next slide, please. I just wanted to also brief you on some of the work that we are initiating on identifying core indicators for monitoring the strength of WASH systems, which Aidan mentioned earlier in his opening remarks. So as the sector is pivoting towards a WASH system strengthening approach, rather than infrastructure-based or project-based approaches, we, as in WHO UNICEF, in collaboration with the World Bank and other key partners at national, regional, and global levels, are facilitating the development of a globally agreed set of core indicators to monitor the strength of WASH systems. And we think that there are numerous benefits for having a globally agreed set of core indicators, including being able to consistently track the strength of WASH systems in a country over time, and also to be able to compare across countries, as well as better harmonization amongst development partners and countries, which we aim to, we hope this leads to strengthening of national monitoring review systems, as well as to reduction of the reporting burden on countries. And so, of course, we're mentioning this because we feel that there is a strong link between the monitoring the strength of WASH systems and monitoring of climate resilient WASH. And so, of course, the work on climate resilient WASH monitoring will feed into this work on monitoring the strength of WASH systems and vice versa. Next slide, please. So on the review that is the subject of the webinar today on monitoring climate resilience in WASH, as has been mentioned, the JMP and GLAAS are conducting a review of monitoring climate resilience in WASH. We're in the process of identifying frameworks, indicators, data collection opportunities, as well as data describing links between climate resilience and WASH. We are working together with a consortium of academic institutions, so with universities of Leeds, Bristol, Oxford, and UTS for the past few months to support this work. A technical working group has been formed, so there's about 20 working group members covering sort of a variety of expertise across the WASH sector, as well as climate resilience. Also to ensure sort of geographic representativeness, to ensure that, you know, the work is relevant and that we will get the inputs needed from a wide variety of viewpoints and perspectives. So this working group has been formed. We've had an initial meeting last week. And so they will form sort of a first level of review of the work of the consortium and the Secretariat, which will then be open also for a broader stakeholder review. And so outputs will identify areas where the GLAAS and JMP teams can focus their future monitoring efforts. However, this whole effort is meant to be very much a multi-stakeholder process. And so this public webinar, I think, is a key step in that multi-stakeholder involvement in this process. So this is, you know, just the beginning of our outreach on this initiative. And we will be continuing our outreach through various global events, as well as future trainings and webinars. And of course, the aim is for all of this process and you know, the outputs from this process to feed into the work on the global goal for adaptation, which Jose has just described. Next slide, please. So there are a few key steps in this process. The timeline is meant to go through the rest of this year as well as into next year. We're currently in the process of this review of emerging frameworks and tools and indicators, which will be followed by development of a long list of indicators, which will then be shortened into a short list of priority indicators, and then followed by piloting. And I think just the key thing to note is that at each step of this process, we expect to receive inputs from the technical working group, but also to open it to broader stakeholder consultation. So we're keen to get your inputs on this. And so, you know, just to so you're aware that, you know, this is just the start of the process. And in the next few slides, Rick will be presenting the call for contributions. But, you know, we hope that you will continue to be engaged in this process over the next months into next year. So I'm going to hand over to Rick for the next slide.
Thanks, Marina. And indeed, as part of this review, we want to cast the net wide. And this is something that we hope that you, today's participants, can help us with. So we've made public a call for contributions. You can see there's a web link below, tinyurl.com/crwash contributions. And we're inviting lots of different things. We're inviting contributions from researchers, practitioners, government agencies, individual industry professionals, NGOs, from the WASH sector, but also from related sectors that might have insights that we could learn from, that are related to defining and monitoring climate resilience at different scales and levels. We're especially keen to identify resources that will be useful for the JMP and GLAAS teams, so development of global indicators. But I think this review will also turn up quite a lot of methodologies, tools, and indicators that are more useful at the program level, which might not be applicable to global monitoring, but still will be useful to review. So we're asking for people to send in materials as soon as possible, but please no later than the 1st of September, 2024. On the website below the tinyurl one, you can tell us about the tools you're sending, the submission, but for files, we're asking you to email them to us at this address, washmonitoring@who.int. And on the next slide, I want to just briefly talk a little bit about what we're looking for. In the next presentation from Barbara, you'll hear much more about what is in and what is not within scope of the overall review. But I just wanted to give a brief summary so that you can also be thinking about this as you hear Barbara And please do put your questions and comments into the chat. We'll be coming back to those after Barbara's talk. So briefly, we're interested in collecting some examples of frameworks, ways that people organize thinking around climate resilience of wash systems and services. But we're really especially interested in frameworks that have been applied and used, not so much interested in theoretical frameworks that maybe haven't been practically put into practice. We're also interested in indicators that are in use, again, for assessing climate resilience of wash systems and services, not that have been proposed but haven't been actually tried. You'll hear in Barbara's presentation that we're not extending the scope as far as community resilience or broader societal resilience, except where those are specifically related to wash or adaptation of wash services. We are looking for methods, both of assessing wash system functioning and user experiences, especially linked with extreme weather events, but also assessing attributes and adaptation actions, things that can be done to make systems more climate resilient or that are features of systems that are climate resilient. The methods that we're looking for and the measures we're looking for probably don't extend as far as water resources. Again, that's a bit out of scope, except where those are specifically relating to something to do with water supply or sanitation, catchment management, linking more towards the wash services. We're also looking for evidence of the links, the effects of attributes of systems or actions that have been taken to adapt wash systems, how those link to resilient performance. So ideally, evidence about the impacts of those kinds of attributes or actions, especially following or during extreme weather events. And while most of those above could be coming from the wash sector, we're also interested to learn from other sectors such as power, roads, housing, health, or education, where they might be wrestling with the same types of issues that we are. We do think that agriculture and irrigation is a bit broader and different, so we're not explicitly seeking contributions about those sectors. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Professor Barbara Evans at the University of Leeds, who's going to describe the work being done by this consortium of researchers. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Rick. And thanks so much for everybody for being here today. It's so exciting to see the level of interest that this work has elicited, and a real pleasure to be supporting the team. Next slide, please. So I represent an academic consortium that is supporting this exercise. We are based at the Universities of Leeds, Bristol, UTS in Sydney and Oxford. Here we all are. I'm not going to introduce us all one by one, but we cover across sanitation, water supply and hygiene, urban and rural experience with a very broad range, I would say, of international experience. We also have some advisors on our team to bring global perspective alongside the working group that we mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we have been doing is working quite hard to frame the conceptually frame this work. It's very easy to say climate resilient wash, but that's a huge concept and that has lots of different meanings. So a couple of things I want to highlight here. One is that we are using what I would describe as one of the more ambitious definitions of resilience. So we're not limiting ourselves to early approaches to resilience, which tend to look, for example, at hazards and risk reduction. We're really interested in resilience as it relates to the ability of systems to respond, reorganize, maintain their essential function, and also maintaining the capacity for continuous adaptation. We recognize that the climate pressures are unprecedented. So we're really using quite an ambitious characterization of resilience. And similarly for adaptation, as has already been mentioned, we're not limiting this to, for example, a particular category, for example, technical adaptations. We're interested in all of the processes of adjustment which can take place that could moderate harm or indeed exploit benefits. Very specifically, we are defining a set of weather and climate-related weather effects, which we use as a proxy for climate change to explore how systems would be resilient to them. So floods, changing precipitation, raising sea levels, fire, severe wind, droughts, etc. We're specifically interested in the whole wash service system, and I'll come to that in a moment. And as I said, we're looking at both adaptation actions and attributes. If we go to the next slide, one of the things we've had to do is define the scope, what's in and what's out. And broadly, the way we've scoped this can be summarized in this diagram. I'm going to show you a slightly more complicated version of it. But at the right-hand end, we have the two, if you like, indicators of outcome, or sort of areas of outcome that we're interested in being able to measure. We're interested in both the service performance, so for example, things that you'll be familiar with, such as continuity of water supply, and also user experience, so the degree to which users experience perturbation in their access to services or stress, or are put under increased pressure in order to access the basic services that they need. As I said, to the left of those two boxes, we can see the big block, which are the adaptation actions by service providers and users, and the attributes of WASH infrastructure and resources. And those are things which we think, well, we're looking for things that we can measure there, which are good predictors of these service outcomes that we're interested in. And finally, going a little bit further back up the tree, we are interested in the governance system, if you like. So adaptation actions by national and subnational government that promote some of these adaptation actions and attributes. If you go to the next slide, these slides will be available to you. We've broken these down into very specific categories, and I just want to highlight here that we are tasked with thinking about this in terms of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. And we're taking hygiene here to really focus on hand washing facilities and the availability of hygiene materials and their disposal. If I go back one more slide, please. In the adaptation actions, we're interested, as I said, in users, service providers, but also supply chain actors. And in terms of the attributes, we're interested in the water and sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, the attributes of water resources, but only as they pertain specifically to water supply. And if we go one more slide on, you can see we've also broken down adaptation actions specifically by national and subnational government. We have had to say that some things are out of scope. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that we recognize that all of these characteristics of resilience in the WASH system interact, they both influence and are influenced by broader resilience questions, such as the resilience of society and the community, the resilience, vulnerability and adaptive capacity of users, the adaptive capacity of service providers, the resilience of water resources, which takes us right into ecosystem services and transboundary water issues, and the resilience and vulnerability of the wider governance system. All of those things we recognize as being super important, but we have left them outside the scope of the specific task which we're working on here. Okay, if we go to the next slide, a question which comes up a lot is mitigation and emissions reduction within scope? And the answer is yes, but the main focus is on adaptation. So we're interested in supporting JMP and GLAAS. We've been asked to support JMP and GLAAS to consider indicators which are good predictors of the continuity and availability of the services which are called for under SDG 6. So we're not specifically looking for indicators of things which are solely focused on reducing emissions. However, in improving resilience, we are very convinced that mitigation lies embedded within the concept of resilience. So to the extent that we are looking for the capability of systems to reimagine themselves in support of a low carbon WASH infrastructure and WASH service, mitigation would be included. The next slide, please. You've seen this slide before. I just want to highlight where we are right now in this process. So if you click one more, currently, if I could have one more click, we're in this process of reviewing emerging frameworks, tools, indicators, and evidence. And that's why we've made this call for contributions. Next slide. But we are also going to use the data and the information which comes to us through that call for contributions as part of currently 3 major reviews which we are carrying out. The first is a review of how framing and indicators for climate resilience have developed and are being used in what we call WASH adjacent sectors, as Rick mentioned. The next review, which confusingly is called Review 3, is looking for the evidence that links attributes and actions related to water supply to climate resilience. So this is an evidence review. At the moment, it's taking the form of a review of reviews, because the water supply world is complex. It's embedded within the water resources world, and we're really trying to identify where existing reviews can help us, so we don't need to complete reviews. Review 4 is doing the same job, but in the form of a systematic review to look at the evidence, if it's there, that links specific attributes and actions relating to sanitation and hygiene to climate resilience. And lagging from those, once we move towards the long list, we will also carry out a review of the latest developments in methods of measurement to see what we can learn from new ways of collecting data that might help us to select indicators that will be useful in the future. Next slide, please. Just to re-emphasize that the call for contributions we've already mentioned, but very much this is a live process, and we're really excited to see what can be shared. Next slide, please. I think that was all from me, and now I get to hand back to Aidan.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that presentation. I think that was really excellent to set the scene, and hopefully it gave some more flavor and substance to the scene setting that was done by Rick and Marina. So I'd like to ask colleagues again to please put your questions in the chat box, but we've had a few questions maybe that we can start off with. But first, maybe Barbara, question on, we know there was a lot of interest around the mitigation in or out element, and maybe you could expand a little bit on that, and also about the water resources management issue. So maybe those are 2 issues that will come up that we would just like your thoughts on. Thanks.
Yeah, those are really great questions. And I do want to emphasize that I don't have an absolute black and white answer. I think the interaction of mitigation and adaptation is incredibly important. I would say that our sort of working hypothesis is that many of the systemic interventions which generate resilience are also very good for mitigation. Aidan and I have had conversations over the years many times about the role of the capacity to actively manage systems and adjust as you go along. And those things are very influential, is our hypothesis, both in increasing resilience and increasing mitigation. When I say that mitigation is not the focus, what I mean to say is we are not going to end up with an index list of 96 technologies with a score for how well they do for mitigation. And the reason for that is because the evidence base for doing that does not exist currently, and also the effect of emission, the extent to which you get emissions from sanitation and water systems is incredibly locally specific. It's very contextually specific. So we're interested in indicators that are measures which will be likely to be producing greater resilience and likely to be producing lower emissions. That's how I would phrase it. But resilience is the primary initial question that we'd be asking. And that brings me to the water resources question as well. Clearly, a water supply system is not going to be resilient if the water resource is completely absent. But what we are really thinking about is that in the JMP and GLAAS remit, the question that we're really interested in is a slightly different one, which is, as people who are designing and managing water supply systems, a good water supply engineer, for example, would already be mindful of the water resources that are available to support a system. What we're interested in is how can we develop, or what sorts of attributes or adaptation actions would we look for in water supply systems that are likely to put the least possible pressure on water resources and maintain water resources quality to the highest possible standard. So when I say it's out, it's not that, I think it's very important to remember nothing we're saying here suggests that any of those additional questions are unimportant. What we're saying is we're looking for the things that we can specifically propose as items that you would want to measure and monitor and track in the water supply, sanitation and hygiene world that are likely to contribute to resilience given other factors. Just to give one very concrete example, if we were looking at a community that lives in an area that is highly flood prone and is likely to become increasingly flood prone, at a certain point we would ask an intellectual question, which is, can we design a sanitation system, for example, or a water supply system that would be resilient to that flooding? Would we even be interested in doing that if nobody could show us a way, for example, that housing would also be resilient under those circumstances? So we're really trying to create a boundary where it's plausible for people to live and receive services, and within that, how can we try and measure things which are likely to give us the most resilient outcome? I hope that answered those two questions, Aidan.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Yes, and I'm just going down through the questions. There was a question from Jean. Great to see you, Jean, on the call. How will this work link in with climate resilient work plan for humanitarian settings? So I think, Jean, it's again to come back to the really the central tenet of resilience in this work. I mean, as Barbara was outlining, I mean, it's all about understanding the resilience element, and this is resilience, of course, which will primarily be focusing on climate, but goes beyond that as well. It goes into fragility being caused by conflict, by natural disaster, shocks and stressors. But as Barbara also said, you know, not just from the traditional viewpoint of risks and hazards, but a bit broader than that. So going, I see several comments around will the presentations be shared? Yes, they will be. You will get, everybody on the call will get the presentation. We will also make sure that, you know, all the links are shared at the end. Again, for the both for the updates and the contributions. So those were shared earlier in the chat box. We'll make sure that we share those again at the end. Then there's a question around the relationship of WASH to the circular economy. And perhaps colleagues, one of the colleagues might like to come in on that, and also maybe a related question around sanitation linking into the greenhouse gas emissions and making this climate resilient. So maybe Barbara, you're a good person to touch on that one. Thanks.
Yeah, it's super important. I think we all completely understand that for general global resilience, we must be moving towards a situation where we are reusing resources, including from sanitation, very effectively. I think what's less well understood and what we're really kind of working on now is how to intellectually frame that. So what would I say? I would say that the interesting question is not, would capturing greenhouse gases, say, from a wastewater treatment process be a good idea? Because that's not the question we're trying to answer. The question we're trying to answer is, what would be a good indicator that a sanitation system in a given location is doing the best it can within those objectives? So I would say the concept of the circular economy and the concept of minimizing emissions are all inside the scope. The intellectual challenge for us is to work out, what would you measure, what would you observe, what would you look for in a system, and what could be measured or observed that would be a good predictor that that's going to happen. And I think that's where we are at the moment. So again, going back to the call for contributions, we're very on side on the idea of circular economy. So what we don't need is lots of definitions of circular economy. But if anybody has any work that's been done to demonstrate how that can be done well and how you can measure its effectiveness and the extent to which it promotes resilience in the overall system, that would be real gold dust for us. So I think those things are they're all included, and I can just glance. I was just glancing at the comments. I think we're probably all on pretty much the same page about our overall ambition for the sector. What we've got to work out is within that, what's the subset of things that we really want to measure and track to help us know if we're going in the right direction.
Thanks, Barbara. And there was a question from Mary, which maybe Marina could touch on around systems and how we can use systems linked especially maybe to adaptation. So I think that's maybe one you could touch on, Marina. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Aidan. And so I guess, I mean, when we're saying systems, I think we're trying to look at all of those, I guess in the context of the work that we're doing, particularly on wash systems and monitoring the strength of wash systems, we're trying to identify those elements that the inputs and processes that lead to better outcomes, and so that allow countries to make more rapid progress towards those outcomes. And from the monitoring context, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify core indicators that will allow us to monitor in a consistent way the wash systems, including inputs and processes which tend not to be very well monitored at the country level, and sort of continue the monitoring through to the outcomes and to the health impacts and other impacts. And so without getting too much into the detail of this, since you know, I think we want to focus on the climate resilient wash monitoring in this webinar, I did just want to mention that we do have a concept note on this work and a global webinar that we conducted last month. And so if you're interested in learning more about this work, we're happy to share those resources with you as well. But just to say, I think that this conceptualization of systems applies to this work that we're doing on climate resilient wash. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Marina. Ranjan had a question, do we need climate engineering to success wash? I think maybe climate resilience in engineering maybe is the clarification there that yes, we do, and hopefully this work will start to track some of those elements of resilience. And maybe I'll pass to you, Rick, on Abhishek's questions next. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Abhishek. So Abhishek has put in a couple of questions. His first question is, are there some first principles on what good indicators are for this process, like low cost, globally relevant, etc.? The second question is around priority, about the hazards, for instance, floods versus heat islands. And then a third is if we're looking for system level studies for GLAAS and household level studies for JMP or some kind of joint development. So I'll take them kind of in sequence. For good indicators, there are a number of criteria we're looking for. I mean, indicators really need to be feasible for data collection at scale. And for the JMP and GLAAS, we're really primarily interested with nationally representative data. To be able to compare from country to country, also to produce aggregates that can be, you know, meaningful at a regional or a global scale. And there might be some indicators which are really useful at a project scale or a local scale or a municipality scale that just are not practical for global monitoring because they require too much site-specific local information. I can give an example from the SDGs where on-site sanitation can impact groundwater quality and could lead to drinking water problems if the hydrogeology is, you know, particularly in a certain way. But that doesn't feature in the global indicators for SDG 6.2 around safely managed sanitation. It could be a very good national or local indicator, but not so much a global one because of the requirement for data collection. Another interesting characteristic is that you want something that can lead to meaningful action. So it's not very useful to get an indicator that tells you there's some issue or some problem if countries can't take any steps to address that problem. So something actionable, I think, is another good criterion. Also, we're interested in indicators that have at least the potential to change fairly rapidly and show impacts over fairly short terms. Again, it's not very useful if there's a problem that you can't move the needle on it until 10 years later. Maybe it's terribly important, but for the JMP and GLAAS, we're interested in tracking things that have at least the potential to be impacted over a slightly shorter time scale. However, I do think that the review will give us lots of examples of indicators that might be more useful at the project level or at different scales, and we'll still document those. As far as the second question on prioritization of climate hazards, I don't know if Barbara wants to weigh in on this, but from my perspective, we will be considering different hazards separately, and certainly we'll focus on heat as well as drought and floods. There may be additional ones, and I don't know actually if Barbara thinks there will be a hierarchy among them, so I'm going to punt on that. And then for the last one about system level studies for GLAAS and household studies for JMP, I would say not so much. I mean, first of all, some of the studies will be more to establish an evidence base about what leads to resilience, how interventions can develop or strengthen resilience. And I think that's not necessarily specific to either GLAAS or JMP. Some things do tend to focus more on the inputs and processes and the enabling environment, which do more naturally fit GLAAS, while others will be more about the outputs and the outcomes, which are more in JMP territory. But I don't think the review will start by saying this is a JMP thing, this is a GLAAS thing. We're thinking more holistically. I don't know, Barbara, did you want to comment at all on the prioritization?
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with you. I mean, we have a list of the sort of main weather effects, I'm going to call them, although one of them is wildfire, that are a result of, well, whose increasing frequency is a result of climate change. And those are listed in the slides, which you'll be able to see. They're not prioritized against each other. They're really all in play. I would link that to another question I saw in the chat about small island states, which obviously is, I mean, that plus also coastal areas which are really at risk of sea level rise are very much on our minds. We do have representation from small island states in the working group. That was something we were very focused on achieving. And I think just linked, Rick, to what you were saying again about prioritization and this question about, is it JMP or GLAAS? I think what we're really trying to do in this first phase is look across the whole potential set of scales of intervention. So right from national systems, service delivery systems, infrastructure services, and also across the range of possible climate and weather related effects. We will end up making some recommendations that certain indicators sit very well across a number of those categories and are therefore going to be ones that we like the look of. But at the moment, we have a very open mind. Over.
Great, thank you. So just still going through the questions, Bhavani had a question around contributions. Please do share your contributions, all of your contributions, Bhavani. I think this is important, and then we can sift through and I'm sure all of these will be relevant and valuable. Several of the questions were answered around context. There's an interesting question around how closely will the indicators link to the climate finance market to ensure the investors will provide the financing for climate resilient WASH? Well, I mean, it's important to be able to track our climate resilient WASH progress for many different reasons, but in attracting financing attracting climate financing for WASH is one of those amongst many. But I don't know if colleagues want to jump in on that one. Just that we have to be informed for a variety of different reasons, and that's another reason to be well informed. So I'm just sorry, colleagues, just moving down through the questions. And there's a question from Mona around climate resilience and environmental sustainability guidance, and also carbon footprints. I don't know if that's already been answered, Barbara, but
I mean, my answer is, it sounds terribly fumbly at the moment, but we're really trying to keep quite an open mind at this stage. So I think all of those ideas and concepts are in play, is what I would say at this stage.
yes,
And
thank
Aidan,
you.
can
Yes,
I just
Bruce.
jump in on the climate finance? I think this is a really interesting one. I think there's been quite a lot of work done by international organizations, by bilateral aid agencies, to define if projects or interventions should count as contributing substantially or partially, or different terms are used, but how much they're contributing to climate resilience. I don't think that we envisage JMP or GLAAS getting into the business of monitoring whether things should be classified as, along those range. But I think we might be able to learn a lot from the thinking that's gone into the development of those systems already. So we would very much be interested in contributions from people who have been thinking about climate financing and what counts and what doesn't count as contributing to climate resilience.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rick. Yes, that's an important addition. So I think, yeah, Barbara's comment did touch on a lot of the points coming earlier around the challenges around context, space, and time, which is being considered in the process, and still, and again, the contributions will inform that. We'll have to refine. So this is an iterative process as we go along. So the more contributions and update and insights that we can gain from the group, obviously, the more we can refine this. I think thank you, Mary, for your comment about on the systems and the indicators related to user participation planning. I think also some of the work going on around the GLAAS and in the core set of indicator development for tracking system strengthening. This is very relevant for that also. So please do feel free to contribute to that process as well. I don't know if I have missed any questions, but if I have, apologies. Tom, yes, the webinar tomorrow is a replication of today. So it's to really catch people in different time zones to make sure that a range of different time zones can be represented on both of the calls. So thanks for that question. And I see Betsy has added in a whole bunch of links for you to, just for ease of reference, to be able to sign up on the different for updates, contributions, and just general background as well. There's a website that you can refer to. And maybe we'll take one last point in the chat box, which is from Safatul, who gives a few indicators, suggestions on indicators for sanitation, which are much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Could I make one plea, Aidan, on that?
Sure.
Super interesting, but a little bit linked. Mary made also the valuable point. If anybody, the biggest gap, the hardest thing to find is evidence that links any of these types of attributes or adaptation actions to outcomes. And I do appreciate that, not all evidence comes in the form of an enormous international randomized controlled trial. But if you have data about interventions which have produced good outcomes, or whatever it might be, or if you're somebody that works in a context which is, suffering with the effects of climate change, and you observe that certain things are, really helping, or, you observe that certain types of communities or certain types of systems, whatever, recover faster, or whatever it is, that's gold dust for all of us, because I think we can make the case to ask national governments to do additional monitoring, or to ask, we're potentially adding to the monitoring burden, and we need to be doing that in a very mindful and respectful way. And the most powerful thing we can do is provide any kind of evidence that justifies the recommendations that we make. So it's my biggest plea, if you have anything which links inputs and outcomes, if you like, in any of this space, that's tremendously valuable, and we will treat that with huge gratitude and acknowledge all of those contributions.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Maybe a quick final reflection from Rick and Marina on any of the questions or any final points you'd like to make before we pass to Bruce.
I can start. I think we've had quite a few participants comment on thinking about resilience coming from the humanitarian response sector. And I think that's an area we need to make sure we capture well in this call for contributions, because I suspect that maybe some of the thinking around broader resilience in the humanitarian sector might really be useful for us for development and climate resilient sector. So that's one thing I'm taking away from this, but I'm very positive about the contributions from the chat. So thanks so much.
And maybe just to add to that, it's just been really exciting to see the level of interest in the topic, and the questions that have been coming in. I guess one thing that this is underlined for me is, again, sort of like the link between this work on climate resilient wash monitoring and the work that we're doing on wash systems monitoring. And so to ensure that we're making the links there, as well as with the broader GGA process. But just a big thank you for your participation and your enthusiasm, and we're looking forward to getting your inputs through the call for contributions and sort of your continuing engagement in the process over the coming months. Thanks.
Thanks, Marina, and thanks to all the presenters. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Bruce, for the closing.
Well, thanks so much, Aidan. And I think Marina sort of said it. I mean, this has really been really great questions and comments. We even have some indicators proposed. So we couldn't give you the thumbs up for all the really nice inputs, but we would if we could. And I think the discussion you had with Barbara, Rick, and Marina has been really a nice one. I mean, and I think it's confirmed a lot of the challenges which we know sort of we're struggling with now, which is the first thing is just this complexity of the subject. And Barbara said, you said open mind a few times, and I think that is a good philosophical kind of point to remember here. We're really trying to do our due diligence as we try to move to indicators that work at global level, because ultimately, there's dimensions. People have talked about systems, and we're taking that very seriously. And we're talking about infrastructure and engineering, and we're taking that very seriously. And we're talking the project level, the local level. We have to have this accounted for as we try to find indicators that work at global level and that influence decision making and tell us if we're doing better or worse in terms of reacting and adapting and being climate resilient. So just wanted to say, on behalf of UNICEF and WHO, thanks very much. So this was just the beginning of a discussion. There was a flood of questions that came at the end, which we were really appreciating. There's going to be a number of touch points that we will be proposing as far as continued public consultation. So there was a slide that had talked about sharing some of the initial findings and frameworks, the long list of indicators, the short list of indicators, and the piloting. And at each of those stages, we're going to be outreaching to the community. You'll see to you through webinars. We also have a website that was put in the chat, which you can keep up to date with anything that's published. And you could find the presentation ultimately put up there so that you can stay in touch. And we will continue to have an exchange, because I think this is learning on both sides. I think a lot of you are here because you want to learn what's good programming and indicators for your country or organization. And of course, we want to learn from you. So let's keep it very rich and try to learn from each other and kind of have almost a community of practice as we move to this stage of shortlisting. So thanks very much, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning. And big thanks again.